Taylor Elwood here with the Magical Experiments podcast, and I am super excited because today we have the amazing, potent, powerful Frauder OG. I know you probably didn't expect to be buttered up quite that way, but there you go. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, and let's get into it.
Thanks, Taylor. It's wonderful to be here, and yeah, it is always hard to accept compliments, isn't it? It's one of those things that I'm working on with this whole Venusian, element of my praxis. So I really appreciate the opportunity to exercise being able to receive some love in that regard. So yeah, I guess a little bit about me. I'm fairly new to the whole Substack experience. Over the last few months, I've been putting out some of my work that I've been working on for the last few years, because I have this tendency to not be able to finish a book before jumping over to another one. I'm like, this is the perfect platform for serializing everything that I've written over time. So, um, as it says here on Substack, I fancy myself a poet and a philosopher, but really I'm just a guy, just sharing some of those potent experiences that I've had working in these varied currents from late antiquity and more modern traditions as well. And so a lot of what I'm about is sharing those experiences in multiple different formats, different ways, whether that's a video content like on my YouTube channel or in written form here on Substack, because I think, different people receive messages differently. And so, one person may be absolutely floored by a poem, but somebody else needs an essay, and somebody else over here needs a podcast interview, and somebody else over here, we all have different ways of learning this stuff. And so I have tried over the years to uh, take a piece of content, right? A writing of any kind, any idea. And how many ways can I flex that into multiple ways so that other people can get at the core of what I'm trying to talk about? And that's been wonderful here as well on Substack. You could toss out a little note here and there. You can toss out a long form piece and so on and so forth. And so that's really it. I am a mystic wanderer, if you will. Labels, they're fun, right? We love labels, but they don't really do us much good when it comes to getting to know the person themselves, right? If you want to know me as content creator, then yes, here's the labels. But as me, the guy, um, I'm just the same as everybody else, just trying to make my way through this thing.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I've read a couple of your books, so I mean, I'm familiar with your content as far as that goes. And of course, I've been reading your Substack and really been enjoying it. I will say this: a couple of things. First of all, we've had a few people join us live, so for those people, thank you for being here. I'm going to invite those people that, as we're talking, feel free to drop comments and questions, anything like that, and I will share
Mhm.
those, and both of us will answer them. Larry just said, we're all just a kid from Brooklyn at the end of this, but also contain the entire
Exactly.
universe in it. And I love that. The fun thing I want to say is, as a men's coach, because that's one of the other things I do, I wear many different hats. I actually do work with men on helping them learn how to receive, because that is one of the areas that men struggle with the most. And we definitely need more of that ability to receive. So I'm glad that you
Hmm.
were able to receive that, because it's so important. And I've actually found that it's one of the secrets to abundance. The more we open ourselves to receiving, the more we actually are allowed to get and give.
Hmm.
Abundance goes both ways. And we're going to talk a bit about that today, because that is definitely an aspect of the Venusian Aphrodisian.
Hmm.
Now, here's the thing. Most people know me as the magical experimenter, and usually as avant-garde magical practices. So the last thing people would probably expect is that I'm also a devotee of Aphrodite, and that I've been a devotee of Aphrodite for most of my life. But the fact of the matter is, I'm a firm believer in the value of traditions and the value of knowing where things come from. You can't
Hmm.
experiment with magic without actually knowing where things come from. And that's one of the things that often surprises people. I have a very well grounded background, and I'm sure you do as well. So tell me a little bit about how you discovered Aphrodite and what it means to be in relationship with her, because you're doing sharing some really amazing content around that, some really amazing magic, and I'd love to hear more.
So, it's interesting the way that we come to the paths that we come to, right? Sometimes the most enriching ones are the ones you never see coming. As a man growing up in the society that we do, there are many challenges, like you said, uh, as with your men's coaching, for us to really dig into the elements that are very Venusian, right? Like we talked about with receiving love. And that was really what led me to her. Um, Oddly enough, I was working pretty heavily within some Shem HaMephoresh magic and working with a bunch of angelic forces. And I was going through all these intense purifications. And there was a sense of I have to purify myself of me, of my meanness, of my maleness, of my everything that makes me a human being, right? You get involved with a lot of this angelic work, and it's almost like you're working with mathematical equations, not beings, right? And and what's funny is they will strip you of certain things without remorse at certain times. Like you ask a certain thing out of an angelic being in that mode of praxis, and they just go, okay. Like, so be very careful what you ask for. And I was asking for this purgation. I was like, I want to understand more. And quite frankly, the Archangel Gabriel kind of just says to me, and this is, through more of a claircognizance, just kind of a knowing that comes to me, this is not the way. You're doing this incompatible to what your human experience is. You are all up in here, but you have all the rest of this to deal with. You have your heart, you have your body, you sweat, you have hot blood, like you want to be here in this realm. So stop trying to get out. Stop trying to ascend or transcend. And that was very difficult for me. And I said to myself, well, what am I supposed to do? And oddly enough, Gabriel goes, here, talk to her. And I'm sitting there in meditation and I say to myself, well, what am I going to do with Aphrodite? This is not something that ever came up to me. Like, why would that be something that I need help with? Well, turns out, as we all I'm sure know, there's a lot that we can learn, especially as a man, right? And traditionally speaking, working as a devotee or someone who is, let's just say, passing on her word, if you will, not necessarily a priest. She didn't have priests except for maybe in Cyprus. They had a pretty good priestly caste in Cyprus. For the most part, this was like woman's territory, right? This is where, traditionally speaking, this is the woman's domain. So from a modern context, I'm thinking, well, what is there for me to learn? Well, there's a lot. Learn to love yourself, for one, which was something I desperately needed help with at that time. Beyond that, learning to accept the body, learning to live through the body, and learning to move through shame surrounded with sexuality, which is one of those things that's, if you've grown up in, say, like an evangelical background like I had growing up, there's a great deal of shame, right? How many of us have this same story? Shame around your desires, shame around your expressions of sexuality, so on and so forth. And it was one of those things that I knew deep down I wasn't dealing with, but I had so well glossed over with whatever story I was telling myself that it wasn't apparent to me right away. And so, in coming to that realization, I was like, well, I have quite a bit of work to do. And so I engaged full force. I think I had already, within a week or two, set up an altar for her and started working with her and researching everything that I could to try and get my bearings. And then a lot of the pieces that you're seeing now come out on Substack are the fruit of that 1 to 2 year period of really digging into and working with her on a practical level.
Yeah, there's a couple things that come to mind. First, I want to just note in regards to angels, because I found this to be very true, and I think people forget about it, is that angels are spirits of function. And as
Hmm.
long as you're working within that function, they'll help you. And if you get in the way of that function, they're going to flatten you. I think that's one thing to just, they're very different than working with like demonic spirits, which are spirits of wisdom, where there's a bit more variability in personality. And so I think that's a really important thing to note. The other thing I want to say is like I feel you on the aphrodisiac connection. I found for me like my connection with Aphrodite started a very long time ago, way before I got into magic. I think I was like 8 or 9, and I read maybe even a little bit older, and I read the Greek myths by Robert Graves. And
Mm,
the goddess that I was drawn to the most was Aphrodite. I particularly remember the telling of the Greek of the Trojan War and how she
hmm
just kind of like he ended up getting the apple, of course, and it was really fascinating. And over the years, I've been also fascinated with Inanna and Ishtar and Astarte, and I've
hmm
read some really interesting connections about how really Aphrodite is a syncretic goddess. Like she's kind of like it's kind of like
hmm
multiple cultures pulling stuff in. So I think that that's a really important key aspect. And the other aspect that I want to kind of speak to here, and I think this is really important, is Aphrodite as a dominatrix of sorts. Like she's definitely got that aspect to her, which I think is really fascinating. So in your own dive and exploration, she definitely does teach about self love and everything else. Um, what has been your intersection or exploration of Aphrodite as she's shown up in your life? In terms of devoting to her, in terms of working with her, in terms of connecting with her, is that divine feminine expression that kind of calls to the sacred masculine within us and pulls it forth, and at the same time
hmm
says like, you better pay attention.
Whoa, that's a tall order. Um, I, I,
I asked tough
right?
questions.
No, I mean, how long do you have? So, I want to touch back on what you just said, which is the manifold nature of her, that syncretic nature of her.
Mhm.
So often she gets bimbofied by
Yeah,
popular culture. And it's not only a disservice to her, it's a disservice to every aspect that she has dominion over as Orania, queen of the heavens. We are talking about something that is much bigger than a simple Olympian dodecatheon god. This is not one of 12. We're talking about a force that is beyond that, that has primordial roots that go back beyond the birth of Zeus, right? So when we're talking about her and the intersections that she can come to us in, there really isn't a limitation. She has an aspect of war. She has an
yep.
aspect of motherhood. She has an aspect of healing. She has an aspect of medicine. She has an aspect of love, of erotic love. And I'm not speaking of erotic in the sexual nature. I'm speaking erotic, of course, in the erotic ascent, this longing that we have either for each other in unity or for the greater whole in unity. So
And that
she
also
has,
adds to the creative current as well,
yes,
that erotic current of creativity. Yeah.
bringing us towards generation, right, as well. So it's not only the longing to ascend back to unity, she's also the longing to descend into multiplicity at the same time. And so there there's no specific pathway to get to her, for she is at every single pathway in my experience. There hasn't been a moment where I haven't been able to meet her on on the terms of being a human, right? She's a mother, she's a lover, she's a warrior, she's got wisdom at the same time. There's fertility in and so for me, it's been amazing to meet her in so many different expressions. And that's like going back to my story. I was like, what am I going to do with Goddess of Love and Beauty? Well, that's been my journey ever since, and that is to find those pockets of beauty in all things. That is the erotic ascent. And that is first I notice it maybe within me. That's our first challenge is can I notice beauty in who I am and can I have full acceptance of who I am? Then we begin to see it in others, right? We see it in the persons closest to us, our family, then people outside of our family in our society, and then we can when we can start to see that in things that are the dirtier elements, right? The elements that we tend to turn our nose up to, when we can see the beauty in that, that I think is the real nut of the truth of Aphrodite, and seeing that it is all generated from that love and beauty. So yeah, I would have a hard time picking just one because she's shown up uh so well in every aspect.
I agree with that. I mean, and I think it's worthwhile to really explore her in all of those different roles, and
Hmm.
especially like the Queen of Heaven. Like that kind of goes back to Ishtar, and it's really interesting to see the parallels there, and to also note that she did come, as far as like the Greek culture was concerned, she came from the East. So really,
Hmm.
this isn't also, it's not limited to one culture. And I think it's
Right.
really worthwhile to explore the multiplicity of cultures and their different perspectives as well, because that brings a deeper understanding. If I only look at her in the lens as like an Olympian goddess of love and beauty, I'm really limiting my connection to her and my ability to be fully present with her. And the thing is she continues to adapt to the
Yes.
time. It's been really fascinating to observe how she shows up in different forms and incarnations.
Hmm. I agree. Yeah, I mean, you can track it all the way back to ancient Sumer, probably before. And it is interesting to see how she is showing up for us today. I often think about that. What would she be like if she was incarnate today? Would she be an Instagram influencer of some kind? Like what would she be doing? Um, it's fun mental fodder to say, how is she showing up for us for today? And I think in many ways our behavior around social media does show how she is present in our lives, whether that is our glorification of beauty in other people, right? Um, Granted, beauty in social media is only so far um, uh, of a representation of what she is. But the longing for connection with each other across the entire world, across cultures, is also present in our behavior there, and how we want to reach out, to learn, to grow, and to 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 engender a sort of what's the word, a transfer, if you will,
Hmm.
of minds and hearts and beauty. So I think um, while she doesn't have a cultural, say, like an American version, or even a Western version anymore, outside of where she kind of ended up in Venus of Rome. I mean, there are some. I suppose you could say there are some pretty compelling arguments for her to have some Marian connections in Christianity, but that's a pretty weak connection as far as what we can do moving past that behemoth.
Well, and maybe we also don't need to make that
Yeah.
connection. I mean, one of the people commented on here that she does remind her very much of Mother Mary, and that's fair. A couple other
Mm.
comments we've had here. One person mentioned that that he was attracted to her, but that he also guessed that he'd been at the surface level with Aphrodite, the aspect of her being influenced by pop culture. And again, I think that is a very understandable
Hmm.
reality. Like we get this notion as to who Aphrodite or what Aphrodite is. So how do we practically? I mean, we can definitely do our research, and I highly recommend that to anyone. Do your research about Aphrodite, do your research about the other goddesses mentioned. But how do we deepen in a practical way our relationship so that we move past that surface and discover the mysteries of Aphrodite? And they are definitely mysteries. Let me be very clear about that because I've experienced them.
So for me, um, the like you said, the research is the first piece. Beyond that, I started working with her sons, the erotes, the sons of Aphrodite. So she has unions in Greek mythology with just about everybody. She has children with a great many of them as well. And so the main erotes are Eros, of course, who is both, depending upon what tradition you're talking about, potentially her father, but at the same time her son, that's just Greek mythology for you. How does that occur? Um, you got the little cherub Eros. There's Eros, there's Himeros, there's Pothos, there's quite a few others. Hermaphroditus, who is her child with Mercury. And if she has a union, there's usually some sort of child. And what I came to understand that as is a way for us to approach the infinite cascade of love and beauty from very specific channels, right? So where Eros is more of a longing, think, an arrow firing out towards something. Himeros is kind of a counter to that, right? This is a different kind of longing. It's like a compulsory longing. Pothos is more akin to that wild love energy, that need to be primal in your love. And so each one of the little erotes has a specific element of love that we can approach and get to know her better, right? It's almost as if out of her unions, love fragments into more digestible pieces. And when we meet those sons, and even some of the, say, the retinue of her, whether that's her daughter Harmonia, or say Hedone, who is the goddess of pleasure, the daimon of pleasure, or Pietho of persuasion, what we get are kind of like doorways of initiation into what she is as a whole. And that's how I approached it, because when I first got into the research here, I'm like, well, there's no book on this, right? There's no latest Llewellyn publication on how to involve yourself with Aphrodite from a theurgical or magical perspective. There's plenty of glamour books, right? And that is one very valid area. I'm not like poking fun at glamour magic, because I tend to use it myself. It was just kind of lacking the methods, for me at least. And so that's how I approached it, was how can I invoke these sons? How can I bring them in and work with them for a short time period, 2-3 weeks at a time, with daily Orphic hymns? So I essentially had to write my own material for it. And that's kind of the product of what's being shared now with the Aphrodite, the Venusian Theurgy series I'm doing. We'll do each one talking about, how do I involve Himeros? How do I involve Anteros? How do I involve this? And what can I learn from this interaction? And so that's how I did it. But that doesn't mean that that's the only way, right? I think that there are so many ways that we could approach her.
For sure. One of the things I'm going to do on the after this live, when I post the video up later today, is I'm going to include a couple of additional resources, some books that I've read that have been helpful that aren't Llewellyn books, but they're good books. That kind of explore this from a theurgical perspective. You might find some of it fascinating. Other people may as well. There are different ways. I mean, in my own practice with Aphrodite, I've had the fortune of working with Lorelei Black a little bit, who is a good friend of mine. She's a priestess of Aphrodite. She developed a unique divination system using cowrie shells with Aphrodite. Aphrodite inspired that for her. So I've done that work and used those, and that's been really interesting. And then, of course, I've developed my own relationship. And I think that's one of the other things to remember, is that when we are becoming acquainted with a particular deity or spirit, it's that there is no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly.
That it is a personal relationship. There may be elements from like what you share or write about that I can draw upon. In fact, you've definitely given me something to play with myself in terms of just like working. I've worked with Eros, but working with some of the other children of Aphrodite, that sounds like a really good direction. So I'm going to explore it. But there's also just the reality that, like, at the end of the day, you and I are two different people. We have our own particular practices, and neither one is automatically better or different than the other. I always like to say it's equivalent, not equal. Like, my practice is equivalent to yours. It's not the same as yours, and that's okay. And so it's really a good thing to explore and develop your own relationship. What are some Aside from what you mentioned there, what are some tips that you would recommend to somebody who might just be starting out here? They're like, oh, wow, I'm watching this. And this is just for working with spirits in general, even like what would be some suggestions you would have on how to develop a personal practice with a given spirit?
Learn to listen, right? First and foremost. So often I find, you know, either in speaking with people beginning on the path or just, pondering comments that people make online, right? You see there's a great deal of talking to the spirit world, but not a lot of listening. And so developing a good faculty of listening is key, especially at the beginning, because it's through the silence that they can speak, right? They're not going to interrupt you, not always, maybe sometimes, maybe a little smack up the head if you're out of bounds. But ultimately, it is learning to quiet the noise inside your own mind. So if you don't already have a meditation practice installed, get one as soon as possible and start practicing so that you can start dealing with the somatic things that interrupt the process of really communing with the sacredness or with spirit. Beyond that, we already touched on research, of course, but being aware that it's not only in your sacred time that these things come through, right? This Just because you have set aside, I have 15 minutes or an hour that I dedicate to my practice where it's a sacred time, it doesn't end when you leave that bubble. This stuff is still moving through you and working with you um, in your mundane life, right? One of the things I see people talk about mundane versus magic. After a certain period, that distinction goes out the window.
Right?
You start seeing everything as magical and you start putting it together and you go, oh, they weren't really separate. That was a false partition that I had built up in my own head. And so realizing that a spirit may speak to you through another person's words, right? Not necessarily inhabiting their body or speaking through their mouth, but inspiring them to say something to you, right? If I'm working with Aphrodite and I'm working on self confidence and whatnot, she may come to me through a friend who says, you look really great today. What are you doing? Or it may come through attractions in opportunities in your life, right? So one of the things that I really work pretty heavily with her is, hey, make my words like honey, like so that when I type them out and I put them out there on Substack or wherever, that people want to gobble them up. Work with me on that.
Well,
Inspire me
clearly
to
it
do
worked, but here we are.
see, it's proof, guys. It's So there's the little things. It's about inviting it into the everyday parts of your life and not, I think, quartering it off into some time. I think Western society as it is today, we have little blocks of time that we've set aside to accomplish different tasks. And there's no, I don't want to say no, but there's a sense that we have to keep these things separate and there's no flow between them. Right. But this is a big messy soup that we're in, and it's constantly talking uh, to these different categories we like to create to make sense of things. But everything else, the world of spirit, we're swimming in it at all times, and so those messages can come through when we're sleeping, especially. Dreams are a big piece. I have a little piece coming out on that tomorrow in regards to Nyx, the goddess of night, who in the Orphic tradition is also synonymous with Aphrodite. It's one thing that a lot of people don't tend to know. But she speaks to us through dreams, right? And this can be true of other spirits as well. So I think across the board, listen, learn to tune in throughout the day and realize that it doesn't end when ritual time is over.
Yeah. I want to, I have a question I'm going to ask you that one of the people asked, actually, my beloved, but I'm going to also comment on a couple things. One, I think it's really important to acknowledge that when we separate the magic and mundane, that in a lot of ways, that's a cultural thing that has been done by the powers that be because it's in their interest to keep us separated from our power. But when we fuse them together and recognize that there is no separation, that is when our magic becomes so potent.
Hmm.
And so that's the one thing. And then the question that Sheena had is, do you have any tips for working with Aphrodite and the Venetian current in a way that honors both ecstatic surrender and erotic sovereignty? That's a great question.
So I would say surrender and sovereignty are part of a circle,
Hmm.
right? Not a polarity, so to speak. Um, it is in that surrender that sovereignty comes, right? So we bring ourselves to that point of surrender. And there's so like if we're asking about techniques here, I have had a tendency to work myself up into some sort of state, whether it's with a drum or chanting poetry in my ritual space, just really working myself up to the point of exhaustion so that I'm removing me and the physical element of myself from the equation so that spirit can come through, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like a somatic draining where I'm just allowing things to pour out of me to make room. And it's in that making room, that surrender, that he grants sovereignty, right? Um, and I think that's true of a lot of spiritual connection. When we make room, that spirit comes through and we are maybe not remade, but reinvigorated is probably a better term. And then we realize some things about ourselves. Perhaps we let go of some limiting beliefs that we have about ourselves. I'm not good looking enough, or I'm not attractive enough, or I don't have the charisma that I need to do this thing. And in the release of those limiting behaviors or thoughts, we gain personal power to go out into the world and then have that sovereignty or reclaim it, if you will. Does that answer your question, I hope?
I imagine it probably does, but I have an interesting angle I want to take this at because I've done a
Sure.
lot of thinking about it myself. And this actually relates to some degree to the mythos of Aphrodite, because what's fascinating to me is that, in a very real sense, that when I look at it, like the Titan Kronos or Saturn is quote unquote the father of Aphrodite. And here's my reasoning behind that. In at least in the Greek mythology, Kronos gelds Uranos and then flings his genitals out into the sea. So Uranos also plays this role of being the father, the
Hmm.
creativity. So hits the sea, and then Aphrodite comes out of the foam. And there's this creative aspect. And we can even go into the whole semen aspect of it, like the foam representing the semen and everything else. I think that there's something very fascinating in that mythology. There's a point of exploration around that in regards to surrender and sovereignty, without necessarily the violence involved. But there's something about it that fascinates me because there is like in this very real sense this act of erotic sovereignty being established, where she rises from the sea. She has claimed that power, the power of the heavens, really.
Mhm.
And in that process, at the same time, what does she embody? She also embodies the desire, she calls in that desire that others cannot get enough of her. And so there
Mhm.
is an act of surrender. So she embodies both the sovereignty of rising up creatively, and at the same time the erotic surrender. And so that's an interesting angle that I've kind of played with a little bit, especially as it relates to Saturn, because Saturn or Kronos is also about boundaries and limitations.
Mhm.
So there's that aspect too. And then, of course, Uranus being creativity. And it just brings up a lot of interesting tangents. And of course, as always, check your mythology and explore it, because one mythology is not necessarily better than the other, and this is all a personal journey. But I offer that as a possible seed and exploration around that very topic.
I think that is a good one. I mean, one could say she even has a third father in Zeus for
Hmm.
after. I mean, if you think about, you have your typical Hesiod theogonies, right? Which they're very precise. Here's the lineage of who begets who, right? Which is very apropos for that time. Then you have a either, depends on which scholar you take on this one, very much older in an Orphic traditional sense, or somewhat younger in the compilation of the Orphic rhapsodic theogonies that we have, where she is reborn after Zeus consumes everything within the universe. When he takes power, she must be reborn. She's actually one of the first things that he recreates in the universe because he sees her as vital to what the cosmos is. And he ends up, and this is the great thing, she has no mother other than herself, orphically speaking. Dione is simply just Zeus in his female form. So he mothers and fathers her into existence rather than having, Dione as this other goddess out of nowhere. And so there's a lot of her birth, essentially what I'm getting at, is so multi-layered, and the meanings behind her birth, like the severance of the phallus of Uranus is corrective justice at the same time, because Uranus was not only violating Gaia and Gaia's desires for bearing children, but he was violating the cosmic order, which is why Kronos rises up. And so right. From that justice, she is born. So there's an element of justice as well in her. So, I mean, you're right. That entire mythos of how she comes to be and the varied forms of it is rich with a lot of things to ponder. And why the original myth gets kind of pushed to the back as we move forward in time. And she just becomes an Olympian as more of a patriarchy becomes established in Greek culture, in Athenian culture. Meanwhile, in the shadows, the mystery cults are telling a completely different tale than what the most people are gobbling up at the temple,
Right. Well, and again, this kind of speaks to the importance of doing the research and discovering, and that's why it's so valuable to have someone like yourself who is doing that and sharing it with people, because this isn't a case where we can always just find this information anywhere. Sometimes it takes a lot of digging up and research.
It does.
So talk a little bit about that. Say more about that. Like, what's some of the research that you typically do, or that you've done, and like in this case with Aphrodite, like how do you go about doing that? Because that's not something that everyone is normally accustomed to. You and I are accustomed to it because we're both writers.
Right.
We know we have to research in order to put stuff out there. But what about someone who isn't?
Well, I mean, the internet is a wealth of information and misinformation, right? So the development of critical faculties and also the development of discernment, right, is something that comes with time and practice, and reading, lots and lots and lots of reading. There's plenty of academic work out there on the subjects. Unfortunately, more often than not, a lot of the academic stuff is really cost prohibitive for people, which is why I try to bring it to the Substack realm. Some of that goody stuff that I've dug out of deep academic tomes that nobody wants to spend $99 on, from De Gruyter. It's like, I get that nobody wants to do a lot of that digging, but there's a lot of great resources. Theoi.com has so much information on her with source texts from ancient Greece, right? So you can see what the authors Hesiod or Aeschylus were saying about her or her children, right? Just that website alone is a wealth of information for you to go to actual primary or secondary sources on the ground in antiquity and late antiquity, so that you can get an understanding of what this particular goddess, this spirit, this current was like for them in their time. What these people said about it go a long way in forming a picture of how it might work for you in the modern world. And so, like, that's a great one. If you are interested in the Orphic side of things, HellenicGods.org, I think, is the one that I love to frequent, because they have so much of Otto Kern's Orphic fragments, which of course are just little bits and pieces that he collected from Proclus or Damascius or Plotinus, so on and so forth, or beyond, about what this Orphic mystery cult was saying about all of these particular deities within the context of, the Greco-Roman or Egyptian world, which is what we're kind of dealing with when we're talking about Greek Orphic material, right? Um, there really shouldn't be a distinction, I don't think, between Orphic and Greek, but like sometimes there's some real weird stuff that happens in the Orpheus versus Hesiod. And so there is kind of a distinction when you start reading it. If you're new to it, realize that this guy says this thing, this guy says a completely different thing. And sometimes reconciling them is not always easy or possible. You just kind of have to go with what your heart says when you're reading this stuff. And that, in my own experience, the more you read, the more you build that faculty of discernment. When we engage with these things, especially in a sacred manner, this tells us what's true, right? This is a nice tool, but if it's not linked here, you don't got these two linked, you get in a mess of trouble about what this says and what this says. And so again, it goes back to meditation for me. That helps to bridge the gap between heart and mind and kind of be able to think with both at the same time. And so just using the internet, going to those two free resources, you have a wealth of information to dig into. And then, of course, there's plenty of wonderful authors on Substack, too, that are on the ground doing this kind of work for them.
For sure. When I'm going to ask if you can later on private message me those two websites, because I'll add those to the additional resources for people. I'd appreciate that, so I can put that in. And I mean that really is right what it boils down to. The need and the willingness to do the research is important. And there are people out there who've done the research. Connect with them, and like you said, at the same time, this is your own personal journey.
Mm-hmm. She meets us where we are at, right? And I find most spirits do. They push us at times, but they're also gracious to meet us where we're at. And that's the other piece that I failed to mention is beyond research, beyond reading, and beyond understanding, putting it into practical, terms helps develop gnosis of some kind, right? Because it's one thing to know it. It's another thing to kind of bring it into your heart, but to put it into a practice where you're physically, say, reenacting or in recitation and you've ritualized it, crystallizes something within the psyche or the soul that brings it to a whole nother level, right? So we can talk about this all day intellectually and say, this is what this guy says and this is what this guy says. But until you reenact, this is the process of theurgy, right? We are recreating what the gods have done. We are reenacting, we're imitating. It's the theater of the gods. When we do that, it crystallizes something within us that allows us a deeper understanding, which isn't intellectual. It's embodied.
Yeah. Well, and this actually comes back to a point where we talked about earlier, which is like learning to listen. And one of the things that I think a lot of times people think that listening is about, these two things, and it definitely is, but it's also about learning to listen with the body. I know that when I connect with spirits, a lot of times the way they connect with me is there's a somatic experience.
It's a feeling, yeah.
It's a feeling, it's a sensation. And, one of the issues I think a lot of times that people have with spirit work is they're like, well, I want the spirit to appear in front of me in a form that I can see, visible to the naked eye. And I want the spirit to talk to me in the native language that I speak in. And then that doesn't necessarily happen. They're like, well, it didn't work. Well, not necessarily. In fact, what you're doing is you're buying into a very problematic approach to spirit work that actually creates more problems in my experience, because I think when we try to force the spirits to show up a certain way, we're actually inviting in a lot of chaos into our lives, because we forget the frequency that they're on is a different frequency. But if we learn to receive them, because this is kind of coming full circle back to the beginning when I complimented you, we learn to receive them and feel that reception come in, then we learn that our bodies are the most divine source of connection that we could have with the spirits. And it's not always about the audible. It is about the full sensation and experience.
It's true. The Neoplatonists, especially Iamblichus, would say that it's about creating a receptacle, whether that's within statuary, which they did, but also within the theurgists themselves. It's about creating that space to receive. So all the purgation, all of the purifying is really just making room for that spirit to come in to you to remake what you are. It's a sense of theosis that is collaborative in a way, where it's both the divine and the mortal, because we have both divine and mortal elements. It is within this unique, very unique crucible, right? The gods don't have a physical form. And so they can't, oh, I don't want to say can't, but they won't accomplish what we can if we choose to strive for it. That is the unique part of being a human being, is that in holding material space, the invitation to be a receptacle for the spirit and be that spirit's hands within the world is a very unique thing in existence. And so it's one of those things that I think we've become fairly misanthropic about because of the state of the world in general, is that people are bad, or are inclined toward bad, or we just kind of are a bunch of mess ups. uh I tend to take a different road now, because I once thought that way. But Aphrodite, this Venus, has shown me that what we are is uniquely suited to solve those problems and ascend above them, right? We are uniquely suited to live above our demons, so to speak. Not that I, position demons anywhere within my magical paradigm. It's not daimones, sure. That we are uniquely suited to be the hands of the gods on this material plane. And so just like we receive someone else, we should be aiming to become a receptacle for their divine inspiration.
I mean, some of the most potent magic that I've ever done has been through that act of receiving. And in fact, one of the things that I've really come to recognize, I'd say my magic paradigm kind of changed in 2017, because I used to be a lot more like, you got to force it to come through. Now I don't do that anymore. It's like, no, I surrender to the experience and I allow it to land. And some of the most potent magic that I've had is I've done some magical work and then I stopped doing any magical work for a while and just allowed it to land.
Yep.
And I've had some very wild and amazing results because of that, because I've let go of the need to try and force it to occur. So we're down here to the last 10 minutes or so, and we're going to wrap up because I've got an appointment here in a little bit. But first, for those of you who are watching, later on this will come out, so you'll get to watch it again. And I'm going to include a subscription link to Frater OD's Substack in there. So, please subscribe. If you've just joined and you're experiencing magical experiments for the first time, subscribe to that too if you want. I'd love to have you. Frater, where else can we find you on the web? Where can we find your books, things like that, if people want to learn more about you and the work that you're doing?
So my two main hubs are On the Mysteries on YouTube, and then, of course, On the Mysteries here on Substack. So those are the two things that I'm really focused on right now. If I ever finish one of the series here on Substack, I will publish it. Probably on, just Amazon, self-publish. But those are the two main hubs. So it's pretty easy. Two platforms everybody has or should have. If you don't have Substack yet, you should get it. They're not paying me to say that either. But it is, those are the two main areas. I have little houses here and there on the web, but they're mostly derelict at this point. I had some projects I was building, but I found homes here on YouTube and Substack. Those are my main avenues for you to read what I'm putting out and or interact, because I do try to interact. If you hit me up with the chat, I try to make myself available.
Perfect.
And I'll give you the links.
Yeah. And I also want to invite you to share a final word of wisdom that people can take with them in this day and moving forward. So what's a final word of wisdom you'd like to share with us?
Wow. Well,
I always ask for hard questions, don't I?
Which one do I want to deploy here? Quite simply, uh, I think that moving through the world without assumptions and expectations is a way to see beauty most easily. Um, our
Mhm.
our expectations and assumptions create limitations for things to blossom in the world, and we don't meet other people or experiences where they're at and allow them to unfold and really truly reach their zenith if we try to put them into a box. And that's a tall order, right? I understand that. It's a tall order because we have to defend ourselves or we think we have to. But sometimes being completely sacredly vulnerable to the world helps us be impenetrable. And that may not make a lot of sense. But when you are so vulnerable to everything in the world, things they show up differently. Like the interactions you have are different. If I build a wall around myself, like let's just take the wall they tried to build in China, and what did the Mongols do? They saw it as a challenge. I'm going to come and scale that wall and take your country. When we build walls, we invite that challenge. When we promote vulnerability, when we project vulnerability, we receive vulnerability from other people. And that allows them to be themselves. And then in that seeing, we can see how beautiful they really are and that we didn't really need to defend against them to begin with.
Ooh, I love that. I fully receive it. Yeah, there is something very powerful about being able to just receive. And I think actually this kind of leans into men's work because one of the things that I've really discovered is the more I allow myself to be penetrated, the more deeply I penetrate the world. And of course, and then the connection with other people. So on that note, I want to thank all of you for coming on here to and leaving your comments. I want to thank you, Frater OD. It's been such a pleasure getting to
Thank
know
you.
you, and I look forward to continuing to read your work. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, guys.